The French symbol is the cock, an empty, loud bird of singular stupidity that wakens everybody up and then does bugger all. And you know what? What did the king say? He said no borders between England and France. Is he the king of a nation state or isn't he?
This idea that all immigrants are welcome, we must have open borders, all cultures are equal. No, they're not. Some cultures are absolutely dangerous and some cultures are really incompatible to us.
Tebbit was this marvellous reminder. He's a classic English figure. He called things by their proper names, and occasionally, the spade is a bloody shovel.
Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks. My name is Philip Kiszely and I'm a senior fellow at the New Culture Forum. David, thank you so much for inviting me onto the programme. It is a real pleasure and privilege.
And in return, delighted. As you know, I'm very fond of the New Culture Forum. I think it does extraordinarily good things. And one of the things that I'm very keen to do generally, but also to do very much on this channel, is to try to bring the disparate forces of this fragmented right together. We have a common enemy. We make enormous hay out of tiny differences. We've replicated the worst features of the left.
Yes.
I always joke about the new party, which has just been founded by Zara Sultana and possibly Jeremy Corbyn, that it actually managed to split before it had been founded.
Which is classic leftist.
But it's also, I'm afraid, we are reproducing. So we are reproducing the People's Front of Judea and the Judean People's Front in a fashion we should avoid. Anyway, forgive me, I interrupted.
No, I think that's a really important point, and it feels as though the right has all the energy, all the political energy, all the cultural energy as well. And just as we have, I don't know, success in our midst, we seem to be determined to throw it away, and it really is disconcerting. I think it's a very important point to make.
It is the issue that we do not yet have a clear political vehicle. This is the problem. And again, what the left has shown consistently is a much more confident handling of political power. Again, you look at this government is a fascinating case. Where it's free from the constraint of its own backbenchers, it's completely ruthless.
Yeah.
Totally ruthless. The restraints on this government are, and I'm going to sound really like a Marxist, the product of the internal contradictions of the Blairite state. Well, really, that's what we have. Anyway, you're supposed to be asking the questions. So.
Right, okay. Yeah, I thought we'd start with France. Okay, and I was interested what you might think about, first of all, Macron's visit and his speech, and as far as I'm concerned, his mind-blowing arrogance, quite frankly, and his obsession with Brexit, but also the one-in, one-out agreement that seems to be on the table and seems to be utterly useless as far as I can see. Should we start with Macron and some of your reflections?
If we must.
If we must.
If we must. But I think we must. The people seem to think that the empty. Remember, here is a man who called himself Jupiter, the king of the gods, who sits in a palace put together under the Ancien Regime, the Élysée Palace, with all the arrogance of one of the Louis. Remember, he's so short, he actually needs Louis XIV's red-heeled, high-heeled shoes. His Laboutin would finish it off. But people think this is a peculiar feature of Macron. I think it's a national characteristic. Remember, the French symbol is the cock.
Yes.
It is an empty, loud bird of singular stupidity that wakens everybody up and then does bugger all. The really important thing we've got to do, and somebody else we need to bring into this conversation, is the king, with his infinitely fatuous remarks. And to remember, of course, that the whole beginning of the Entente Cordiale is the product of the intervention of another monarch, directly into foreign policy of Edward VII back in 1904, with, I think, now generally agreed to be catastrophic results and leading by a primrose pathway to the everlasting bonfire to the First World War. But the thing to understand is fundamentally, and this is, we've got to get this clear, France, with all its charm, which I am completely susceptible, with the beauty of Paris, the product of cowardice, the Second World War, the attraction of French culture, of the language, of the, which I used once upon a time to speak very well, of its food, of its countryside, of some of its smaller towns, and so on. France fundamentally is a failed civilization.
Yeah.
This is the thing we've got to understand. This is the degree of bitterness of France. The notion that France, since the Second World War, has been a friendly power to Britain is simply deranged. It has never forgiven us for 1940. More importantly, it never forgave us for the defeat of Napoleon. Remember, the regime in France now, the Fifth Republic, is a non-imperial in the sense of not actually calling the president an emperor, but it's a version of the Napoleonic state that succeeded the French Revolution. And it's really important we understand this. And who made sure that France failed? England, Britain. For 400 or 500 years, Britain fought France for a reason. The British, the English, knew that France was a different civilization. They disapproved of its Catholicism, they disapproved of its absolute monarchy, they disapproved of its centralization, they disapproved of its legal system, of its reckless use of torture, of its king worship, Jupiter, all of this stuff. We disapproved of it. And fundamentally, and this is something we've completely forgotten, we disapproved of it philosophically. France gets it wrong. What was the struggle about between England and France? It was the struggle, again, we are both arrogant people. We're both imperial people. It was no less than a struggle for world empire. It's the modern equivalent of the struggle between Rome and Carthage, as the men of the 18th century understood very well, as Churchill understood completely. Churchill describes the great triumph of England in a war we've completely forgotten, the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 63, as the First World War, because that's when the British conquer India and conquer Canada. And what we've forgotten, about India, with all the fuss about what did the Raj do in India, India had one choice in the middle of the 18th century. Was it going to be conquered by England, or was it going to be conquered by France? And if you want, and I constantly try to remind people of this, if you want a symbol of how terrible the French Empire was, it's Haiti. If the French had conquered India, it would look like Haiti. There is not a single good thing that survives of the French Empire. On the contrary, the catastrophe of Vietnam, the catastrophe of most of the Middle East, much of Francophone Africa. France is essentially a deductive culture. It's the culture of an absolute monarchy. It's the culture of academies. The absurdity of French. They try to freeze French of the late 17th century. The dictionary of the Academy is an attempt to arrive at the right word. The Oxford Dictionary is the complete opposite. It records usage. In other words, France is a culture which is from on top, imposed down, general ideas, and bugger the consequences, whereas the other English and England and English science is, on the contrary, it is inductive. It comes up from facts. It comes up from argument. Why have I gone on about this? Because what happened was, in the late 17th century, when there was that first great conflict with Marlborough and against the France of Louis XIV, we knew what we were fighting. We fought and we won. At the end of the 18th century, in the wars against the French Revolution and Napoleon, we knew what we were fighting. We produced a rival philosophy to the philosophies of the French Revolution. We came up with those two supreme thinkers of English induction, Edmund Burke on the one hand and Jeremy Bentham on the other. The problem, Philip, is ever since the Second World War, joining the EU, dominated by France and shaped in its own catastrophic image by de Gaulle, and particularly since 1997, when Blair decided to carry out a concealed, slow burn French Revolution in England. And what we're reaping now is the terrible consequences of imitating France. That is what has gone wrong. And it's the problem is, of course, people like Starmer, his Attorney General, Lord Hermer, are completely sold on this stuff. They love it, because, of course, it gives power exactly to people like that. There's been this extraordinary shift with the Labour Party. Remember, the Labour Party, going back to its great days, going back to Attlee, going back to Bevin, was appalled at the Franco-German Union of the Coal and Steel Pact. Attlee complains bitterly that we had fought to free both of them from the horrors of Nazism, and they got together behind our backs perfectly deliberately to try to produce it's a completely different view of how a state should be run from the freewheeling, free market, open societies of the Anglosphere to these regulated, top-down, intensely legally bound societies, because they were all, the key to understanding Europe is they were all absolute monarchies. You know, everybody goes on about French justice. Why do you have an examining magistrate? Because they are the examining magistrate under Roman law. And do you know what it meant? They applied torture.
Yes.
The notion of examination is examination under torture. Do you know what the French for torture is?
What?
Question. The question.
Question, yeah.
It was such a regular practice that in the judicial notes, you have a simple numerical note in the margin, 1, 2, or 3. That's the degree of the torture.
It's extraordinary. I mean, just thank you for that wonderful historical painting, in a way. Very, very visual. A couple of things that came out there for me is this idea of a revolutionary society, which is in many ways a completely authoritarian society.
Totally.
Well, I've been thinking quite a bit over the last few days about Starmer and that authoritarianism.
The instinctive
Exactly.
hatred of freedom. Remember, freedom's an English word. It's a powerfully English word. It's an English idea. Starmer, again, you know, our personal experiences, Philip, are very important. I read about your terrible experience this morning. For me, obviously with no element of violence, was the whole element of my cancellation back in 2020. Who alone, when it was cranked up yet further by the intervention of some sort of Muslim detective in London to a potential charge under the Public Order Act, you know, with mandatory imprisonment for God only knows how long, who alone of a public figure intervened to say this would have been appropriate to be tested at law? The Times mocked it. Even The Guardian said it was ridiculous. Who alone said that the charge might be worth investigating?
Who?
Keir Starmer.
Oh, God.
This is what we've really got to understand. This has been an extraordinary year. The tectonic plates really are shifting. And if you recall, there was that extraordinary moment earlier in the year when J.D. Vance tackled the Security Conference in Munich and denounced them so vigorously that the soppy-eyed German president burst into public tears under his reproof. But what Vance was saying, you in Europe have abandoned liberty. You have abandoned freedom. You have gone for the regulated state in what you can say, and what you do is to be controlled by a state-engineered view of propriety, or what I would bluntly say are state lies, And America's gone in a different direction. It's exactly like a revival of George Orwell's 1984. If you remember, in 1984, Britain is Airstrip 1. It's the frontier between the great, Orwell understood perfectly, the great continental power with its tradition of absolutism, and of course then the Anglo-Saxon world has been equally perverted. But we're the marginal. And the whole aim of the left is to take us fully into this regulated, opinion-controlled, identity card-controlled world of Europe. And to separate as far as possible us from our traditional alliance, not only with America, but with the rest of the Anglophone world. The great problem with the position of people like Starmer, governed by the French idea of universals, they've totally lost sight of anything called the national interest.
Exactly.
The supine posture, and the way Starmer behaved with Macron was like an envoy to the Chinese Ming court, where you were required to perform, where you were required to kowtow, which involves striking your forehead on the floor in front of the emperor. And he behaved exactly like that.
He behaved exactly like that. And you've just used a couple of words there, absolutism and control. And I think Macron's obsession with Brexit in that speech.
We rebelled.
We rebelled, exactly. And this is why this will just not go away. It's the ultimate betrayal as far as they're concerned. We're out of control, and we must be
And
reigning.
it's why again that whole section of the Remainer obsessed elite in Britain decided they hated their own country.
They hated their own country and they loved France.
Remember, these are the kind of people who have their villas in Tuscany and their elegant chateaux just outside Bordeaux and their petit chateau just on the other side of the Channel, and think French food is absolutely wonderful and provincial England is filthy and tiresome, and the kind of Matthew Parises who sneer at Clacton.
Well, the key thing about this as well, there were two issues here, aren't there? One was this incredible snobbery, this hatred of the white working class.
Or indeed the white middle class, the whole sneer at the suburb.
Yes, but there's also this kind of self-loathing as well, which Britain, our heritage, our culture, our history, all of that is essentially thrown into the dustbin for several reasons. I think a part of it is self-loathing.
Again, Orwell, remember, is the first person really. I mean, Orwell is one figure, but it does go back much further. It goes back to the 19th century. I don't know whether you are. I am a slight aficionado of Gilbert and Sullivan, but there is in Coco, the executioner's song in the Mikado, there is that wonderful thing: those who sing the praises of every century but this, and every country but their own. And it's the Oscar Wilde crew. It's the direct ancestors of Stephen Fry. I mean, all that lot. It's a particular style that sees that as being sophisticated and ours as really rather coarse.
And there's something else with it, David, as well, isn't there? You were talking about Orwell there, and I was thinking about Anthony Pohl and The Dance of the Music of Time and some of the characters in that kind of sequence of novels. And there's a sense of real naivety about it as well, isn't there? Which puts us in danger. This idea that, all immigrants are welcome. We must have open borders. All cultures are equal. No, they're not. They really are not. Some cultures are absolutely dangerous, and some cultures are really incompatible to us. This is one of the reasons. It's about naivety. It's about self-loathing. It's about the hatred of the English working class. It's about punishment. And now we have this situation where, in 2022, for example, David, we had 40,000 illegal immigrants coming across the Channel in boats. 40,000. While the Labour Party have been in power, we've had another 44,000.
The numbers are accelerating.
The numbers are just accelerating. I think last night we had the best part of 800 migrants coming over the Channel, just yesterday. And now Keir Starmer is talking about 1 in, 1 out. I mean, what the hell is going on there?
No, he's not. He's talking about 1 in 50.
1 in 50, yes. He's selling it as 1 in, 1 out.
The real problem is, if you say there's such a thing as universal human rights, what it really means is, you said, how can we possibly think that these immigrants are like us, that they should be admitted as though they will, dare one say it, become a Welsh choir boy? As you remember, we were sold, Ruda Cabana was. What can produce that idiocy? Well, if you think about it, it's actually inbuilt into the notion. If you believe in universal human rights, Philip, you believe in a universal human being. You believe that fundamentally we are all the same, apart from the accident of history, which, of course, as you were saying, you try to eradicate. Now, what that really means is there shouldn't be nation states. The whole aspiration of, I mean, France is this profound paradox. At least they have some sense of national interest. It may be mad, it may be eccentric, the determination not to include the French nuclear deterrent in NATO, all of that sort of thing. The arrogance of de Gaulle, the folly of France in enabling the Ayatollah Khomeini to return to Tehran and all that. But at least they have a sense of national interest. But what they pretend is that their national interest is the interest of all of Europe.
Exactly.
With their dominating diplomatic role in Europe because of the supine policies hitherto of the German government after the Second World War and so on. But the problem is that the intellectual thrust of universal human rights is to say there is a universal human being, therefore there shouldn't be nation states, therefore they shouldn't be boundaries. And you know what? What did the king say? He said no borders between
Yes.
England and France. Is he the king of a nation state or isn't he? And it is, again, it's been one of the great problems with our monarchy. It's been lost in this myth of the Commonwealth, which, of course, again produces this insane supranationalism. And again, the king's ambiguity between Canada and Britain in those moments of very delicate negotiations with America. But the fundamental problem is human rights law. Human rights law essentially says that there shouldn't be a frontier, that to stop anybody in need, or indeed anybody who wants to cross a frontier, is inhumane, is against this higher doctrine, which, remember, stands above our law. The reason that we can't stop the boats is because we were stupid enough to incorporate this absurd fiction of the European Convention on Human Rights into our law and bringing on board all the ridiculous baggage that judges had piled on top of this thing over the last 30 or 40 years. We've also, of course, again, it's really important, I've been blaming Labour. Of course, the Conservatives were fully and criminally, and I will use that word, criminally complicit. In 2010, they did not only did they do nothing to repeal this, they actually entrench it at every single stage. We know all about the Boris wave, but it's much worse than that. The whole apparatus of this regulatory state, which is extraordinarily generous to the foreigner and extraordinarily harsh to the native.
Exactly.
This bizarre paradox is entrenched and developed. I've become very interested in this. As you know, I'm primarily a 16th century historian, but I'm very much a historian of the Constitution and of the development. I was an administrative historian, the developing and shaping of British government. And if you actually look at how human rights law has been shape-shifted to serve the entire program of the left, in a very extraordinary way. And again, the reason that we've never escaped the grip of the Blairite years is our legal system is now directly politically prejudiced. What I find extraordinary, there is an open admission of the fact. The judge, Tom Bingham, the last First Lord before it was all inflated into the Supreme Court, writes I think the book, which is the key disaster of English government of the last 30 years, on the rule of law. And he delivers a series of elaborating lectures on it. And it's one of them, there's a paragraph which just summarizes everything. Listen, and it is truly astonishing. This is what he says. Human rights law, by definition, is anti-democratic insofar as it prioritizes the dispossessed. He says it's counter-majoritarian. He says it is biased to minorities. It's designed to protect minorities against the majority. And you know what? In this paragraph, Philip, he actually goes on and he lists the protected minorities, the mentally sick, Ruda Cabana, the Kalokani, the Roma, the completely unsocializable,
I think there are a few issues here, David, and some of the words you've just said really leap out at me. The idea of generosity versus harshness, okay, the idea of the manipulation of language, and I'm just thinking now we've had this week the anniversary of the 7/7 bombings, and I think we've both been thinking about this quite a lot. What struck me at the time actually was Ken Livingstone, who was the mayor of London at the time, said we mustn't blame anybody. This we mustn't blame anybody. This comes directly from what you've just been saying. It links directly to what you've just been saying. Because they didn't want to blame anybody, then you get other atrocities which we don't talk about.
The Manchester Arena bombing.
We get the Manchester Arena bombing. And how do we respond to the Manchester Arena bombing, David? It's don't look back in anger, one love.
Bring us all together, embrace in love. You know, it's a politics of pure sentimentality.
But it's also, sorry to interrupt, David, it's dangerous.
Oh, I mean, sentimentality is dangerous.
Yeah, exactly.
Sentimentality is the opposite of genuine feeling. You know, this is those wonderful sections of Jane Austen on this, recognizing instantly false sentiment and false sympathy. And again, one of the things that's gone fundamentally wrong is that we have presented what could be acts of decent private charity. Now, if an individual thinks that a refugee deserves accommodation, needs to be taken into their home and whatever, fine, if they pay for it. But the state is not a charity. We are not bound by Christian ethics. You will remember Jesus had a very powerful view. He said, "My kingdom is not of this world." It was not his. Christianity has a view that if you actually bother to read the New Testament carefully, that this world will dissolve very quickly and we will be into paradise. Now, there's no provision whatever for a sustainable society. And remember, what does he say to the rich? It is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Sell all your goods and give to the poor. Now, do you wonder occasionally if Rachel Reeves has been reading that as a basis for Labour's fiscal policy? Because there are moments when it seems we have, but it's this complete confusion.
Well, it's a combination between that and the Communist Manifesto, isn't it, really?
Which, remember, is another form of mad religion.
We inherited all of that stuff. We've got identity politics, which is essentially a cult. We're forming our society around identity politics and, as you say, minority rights. And that can only go one way. That can only end in catastrophe. Now, I think catastrophe was about 5 or 6 years ago. We're beyond catastrophe now, and we're thinking about how to pick up the pieces.
But equally, what I think is important and what we've only, I think, just begun, or maybe I'm being autobiographical and saying I've only just begun to think of what has actually happened, to begin to analyze clearly and dispassionately what's happened, which is therefore the first step to doing something about it. I think, again, going back to that conversation where we began with France, with the visit of Macron, with that infinite patronage. Blair tried, when we all laughed ourselves silly, when Blair talked about a new country, you know, the world's oldest functioning political system. Okay, I know the Japanese Mikado goes back further, but of course, Japanese politics now and Japanese politics then, wildly different. We have an identifiably continuous politics from roughly Magna Carta. And then, but you know what? Blair actually achieved that. He superimposed on our own structures new systems of law, new systems of devolved power through the quangos, the rule of experts, a kind of platonic, again, very top-down French-style politics, and so on and so on. And because it was done gently, because it was never advertised, it was never explained, it was done piecemeal. It's that thing about slowly boiling a frog.
The style of it as well was really important. You know, it was sharp suits, it was articulation, you know, it wasn't Tony Benn.
It was cool Britannia. But I think that what we can now see is how we've got a way out. we can recognize now, and of course, it was also coupled with not simply a new country in terms of a new constitutional or semi-new constitutional settlement, also with immigration. You actually change the population of the country, rubbing our faces in diversity, in that famous phrase. But what I think we can do now is we can recognize how we've got to begin to undo it. In other words, I think we are in, and we're seeing it with the mounting financial crisis, the general disintegration of the public sector, despite the vast amounts of money that's thrown at it, the clear incidents of major strikes, which are going to follow from the antics of the junior doctors. I shall keep on calling them junior doctors because it gets them so very cross. But what we can now see is we've got to begin a program, as exactly happened in the 1970s, when Thatcher and Keith Joseph recognized that the Conservative parties since the Second World War had been complicit in the disaster of the socialism of the Attlee government. And you had to begin the process of repeal. You had to begin the process of undoing.
I've heard you speak on several occasions, and I've seen audiences be absolutely wowed. You've talked really in terms of a conservative revolution.
Counter-revolution.
Counter-revolution. Yeah, we're a post-revolutionary society. But can you just talk a little bit about that counter-revolution? And
Yes,
what
I
it
mean,
means?
because the word revolution is a word of the left, I want to talk about a restoration. Remember, what we had in the 17th century, we had the world's first, I think, large-scale revolution, the Puritan Revolution of the 17th century, which what began as an attempt at cutting us off from our history. People have completely forgotten this. We were the first people to publicly try a king and cut his head off. The destruction of the royal regalia in 17th century England was much more radical than it was in France. They tried to outlaw, to begin with, the very name king. To recall streets because they were called King Street or the King's High. You tried actually to eradicate it. And then very quickly we realized we couldn't do it, that we shouldn't do it. And there is this mounting appetite under Cromwell, the man, of course, who was responsible for the execution of the king. There was this mounting realization we had to reconnect with our past. We had to once again have legitimate government. And we are the only people ever to have reversed a revolution without foreign intervention. And it's that extraordinary process of the late 17th century. We didn't get it right first time. When you restored the monarchy in 1660, you restored most of the old problems, and it took you another 25 or 30 years. The dethronement and exile of James II, and the Glorious Revolution, and above all, the invention of the office of the Prime Minister in the early 18th century, before you get the new smooth functioning of the system of politics. But we did it. We restored. We preserved that peculiar sense of, I call it Anglo-Britain, which was the idea that the governors in some way answer to the governed, the complete opposite of France, where there is the idea, the loftiness of Macron, je suis Jupiter, I am a god, you little people. And that, of course, has become the motto of the left. We've got to break it. We know how to break it now. It is piecemeal, severally, in gross and in retail, to undo everything that the Blair government did.
It's almost restoring that contract between generations, isn't it? If you have that Burkean thing.
It's the Burkean thing of reconnecting past and present. But you see, it's about something much more fundamental. It's going back to the right way of doing things. I'm a great believer, again, I've been saying rather disrespectful things about Christianity. Jesus was remarkably shrewd politically. I have no respect for his ethics, but I think his political judgments were jolly shrewd. And when he said, "By their fruits ye shall know them," there's a very good way in which you can test something. Does it work or not? What are the results? We can now see the results of Blairism. We can see the results of everything being new and shiny and made out of plastic and chrome-plated and built on sand. And you can see where it leads to. It leads to this desiccated, ruined landscape of half of England, and particularly half of English towns. That's where that worship of novelty leads to. If you want to go back and look at the old rooted England, which still survives, go and look at Westminster Abbey. Go and look at the historic centre of London, the sheer magnificence of the thing, and look at what we've risked throwing away. And it seems to me it's also some very interesting stuff is now being done, of course, with AI. I don't know whether you saw it. Neil Ferguson isn't always right, though he's a very brilliant historian, but there was a really impressive essay which he wrote last week on the use of AI in universities, saying the only way in which we can save the human brain will be if highly select students are put in an environment for 3 years in which they are not allowed access to it. And you've then got to learn to do things. You've to learn to think. You've got to learn to research. And do you know what then? You can use AI brilliantly.
It's about doing things properly, isn't it? And just as you were saying that, I was thinking about the Blair project and now the Starmer project, if you can call such an absolute dog's breakfast a project.
Well, I think it is. Starmer sees himself as, and he said this in the New Statesman. He sees himself as the last chance of preserving the Blair settlement. So, in other words, he's like a late Roman emperor, powerless in the semi-ruined Ravenna, with us the barbarians at the gates, and much nastier barbarians too, desperately trying to keep this show on the road with, again, like Justinian at the very end of the Roman Empire in the West, trying to the great Roman code, the great Justinian code. So with his Lord Hermer acting, I see this whole approach to law as a bit like King Canute.
Can we just focus on that for a second, David? Because the Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, this is really interesting. So he's told lawyers essentially that they should assume every decision made by a minister will be subject to legal challenge.
This is the whole development that was pushed in our law from Lord Denning, and more particularly with the whole gigantic growth of judicial review, and more particularly by Tom Bingham. Bingham, you use that word revolution, that word that I picked you up on. Bingham talked about a legal revolution, which he was pioneering with no input from Parliament, no input from any politician, purely on his own initiative and with the weight of judicial authority. And what is effectively done is introduce a new fundamental principle into English politics. They call it the rule of law. Now, there are two views of the rule of law. The traditional view of the rule of law, which in an interesting paper on all of this by Lord Wolfson, the man who held Hermer's job, was Attorney General I lose track of all the Conservative governments that we've had in one of those Conservative governments. He has written about the thin and the thick view of the rule of law. The proper view of the rule of law is simply its proper procedure. You follow proper procedure, and government,
which is the thing we keep coming back to, doing things properly, isn't it?
Doing things in the old way. Unfortunately, what Bingham did, listen to this. Bingham rewrote the rule of law, and Hermer is his pupil. And I'll take you through just how you can identify. There's a literal chain. Let's just look at it because it's so extraordinarily interesting. What Bingham said was that the rule of law has got 8 fundamental points. Now, why 8? 7 was good enough for God, but Lord Hermer, of course, Lord Bingham goes one beyond. 5 of them are completely unexceptional. They're things like the fact that the law should be clear, that it should be readily available, none of which lawyers have done anything about whatever, and it's got hugely worse. As you know, justice is actually collapsing, particularly criminal justice is actually collapsing at the moment. However, he introduced 3 new ideas. The first was a perversion of the idea of equality before the law. He said that equality before the law means, the logic is absurd, that equality before the law means that the same law applies to everybody. So the newly landed illegal immigrant has exactly the same protections as you and me. The second is all human rights law is a central part of the law of England. And most interestingly, all international law is. And this is done purely on the say-so of Tom Bingham. And what you get with Hermer is a deeply simple-minded application of this, but simple-minded, but because of the job that he's in. But what it really means is every political decision is now second guessed. What you've done, you can view this in two ways. You literally have a kind of, as in the Soviet Union, every minister in the Soviet Union, every manager of a plant had a party commissar sitting next to him. And that was where the real power lay. I'm afraid that's the situation we've got in now. The rule of law becomes the rule of lawyers. But the thing that's most terrifying, the Supreme Court is within a whisker of adopting the principle that the rule of law defined like this is a co-equal proposition of the Constitution to parliamentary sovereignty. So the Supreme Court is just at the point of saying that acts of parliament can be ruled by it to be unconstitutional. It's deadly. But you see, what again is extraordinary, it is the belief of the left in the government by experts. They are naturally Platonic. And we saw this, we saw the enthusiasm, particularly of people like Starmer, The Guardian, the BBC, for COVID. COVID was just what they wanted. But again, you can see the catastrophe of this. I mean, what I thought was wonderful, the committee even arrogated to itself the title sage. You know, just like the philosopher kings of Plato. But of course, you saw immediately the fundamental problem of the single issue expert, and that because their only interest was diminishing the number of deaths from COVID, you completely shut the NHS down for anything else. In other words, you didn't care if somebody died of a heart attack.
And now we're seeing people suffering from cancer and dying who absolutely wouldn't have done. There's a superimposition, isn't there, of this structure over what I would call the wisdom of tradition. Okay, and that
the traditional constitution and a functioning constitution. I mean, again, remember, far from us being fuddy-duddy, we gave the world this modern language of politics. The Greeks sketch it out first. We, with the universal idea of parliament, of representative government, of voting, of constituencies, Britain gives this to the world, and it worked. It worked for us in countries as sophisticated as we are, and with a similar high trust society. It works elsewhere, and we threw it away, as I said, for the shiny. The Blair government was the ultimate spiv government. Everything was new, shiny, cheap. It was a Ratner government, and as with Ratner's jewelry,
it was crap.
It's crap. It's fallen to bits.
I think can I just summarise there, because I want to get on to Lord Tebbit.
The opposite of Ratner.
Exactly, but I just wanted to say something about that, and the shiny newness is something that has always had, quite literally and metaphorically, a red flag for me, because what these people have done, they've chipped away at our identity, at our heritage, and at our history. And a people with no history, or a tampered with history, that is a fundamentally unstable. It's a destabilizing process, isn't it? And people who don't know themselves and who don't know their past are fundamentally unstable. And I think that's the same with societies as well, which takes me on to the Thatcher government, Lord Tebbit, who unfortunately passed away this week. Could you give me some kind of reflections on what he and what that period meant to you?
Well, again, it's really important for me to be quite frank. I was infinitely less political then than I am now. I enormously welcomed Thatcher in '79 because, like everybody else, one had experienced the mounting chaos of the 1970s. We forget just how much it was a period similar to what we're going through now. This sense of everything stopping working, huge financial crisis, much of it engineered by the Conservatives. We even had the equivalent of Liz Truss. We had the Barber boom. I knew it bitterly. I was buying my first little flat in London, and if I'd been able to move at the beginning of '72, I'd have got it for £3,000. And when I bought it at the beginning of '73, it was 10,000. Property prices multiply 3 times in 1 year. So I think we've got to remember that's the background to Thatcher. That's the background to Tebbit. And what they were concerned to do was to say, look, there are real things. Tebbit is the arch anti-sentiment. We were talking about that word, sentimentalist. Remember, the famous denunciation of as a house-trained polecat and whatever. That he was a man who dared to be rude. He was a man who dared to say what it is. There was a marvelous quality of the unvarnished. He was supremely unsentimental.
And he was a kind of working class hero as well, in a way, wasn't he?
Yeah, of course he was. I mean, he called things by their proper names, and occasionally, the spade is a bloody shovel. And he was very, very good. He was very witty. He had an infinitely acid humour, very, very, very effective. But what it was about, remember, he recognised that you had to have a party of the right that was unsentimental. That you again, it's what we were talking about, trying to adopt a public ethics that's based on a tenderized view of Christianity. It does not work. Whereas, of course, we've had political leaders on the left, like Cameron, and worst of all, Theresa May. When Theresa May denounces her own party as the nasty party, and you start throwing money at everything, you try to be nice to everybody. You can't be nice to everybody. If you're nice to everybody, you run out of money very, very quickly. Very quickly. And Tebbit was this marvelous reminder of those truths. There was a quality. I mean, he's a classic English figure. There's a quality. Though Dr. Johnson was more generous as a character, but there's something rather like Dr. Johnson. There's that fundamental hard-edgedness about it. He was that incredibly angular face. And here was somebody with this craggy sense of reality. You remember when Johnson was confronting the arguments of Bishop Berkeley that the world only exists because it's viewed by God, that we're a figment in the divine mind. Johnson, how does he deal with it? He finds a big stone and he kicks it. He says, "It's there. It hurt." There's reality. And Tebbit was like that. He was the man who, in many ways, he was the stone that other people had. But there was that just embrace of the real and saying to everybody, you've got to recognize the left is a world of unreality.
Of unreality, of trans men, of kind of identities and shifting identities. And I'm thinking about Lord Tebbit so much at the moment because he was the polar opposite of that. And in a way, we desperately
The polar cat, the untrained polar cat.
we desperately need another figure like him. David, I think that's a brilliant place to stop. Thank you so much. What a fantastic conversation. Can we do it again, please, soon?
Yes, certainly. Wonderful.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Bye-bye now.